existence of it as opposite, but its existence as goal, as telos. Misery as goal. If your goal as an individual is to increase the level of misery in the world, and you elect leaders in a form of governance, of increasing, maximizing misery, if there is hell, if you want to talk about an apocalypse, that's the apocalypse. That's the apocalypse, period. Like seriously, the apocalypse is the governance, the absolute governance directed towards exacerbating misery. That is the apocalypse. There is nothing conceptually more heinous than that, right? And in a sense, I guess that's why the zombie apocalypse thing is so crazy, because the whole point of the zombie is to eat you alive. I mean, how miserable existence is that, right? To be eaten alive. I mean, and this unfortunately is now like happening in the real world, which is precisely why, yeah, just super disturbing. Like, bizarrely disturbing. Misery is evil in that it is the goal one comes to without there being, this is Al-Farabi, without there being beyond that a greater evil to which one comes by means of misery. The second is the voluntary actions such as to lead to misery. Okay, I'm going to stop here, just pause for a second, switch batteries out, come back and continue the lecture. Okay, so we recognize, I mean, how powerful it is if you think about it, right? The idea that an individual would deliberately, intentfully posit misery as the goal. You can't have anything that unfolds from that but evil, right? So that the role of the individual as a sole actor in attempting to manifest misery as goal is identified as a sadist. And the argument would obviously be that the totalitarian regime or the tyrannical regime is manifest, you know, it manifests in the exacerbated misery of the population. And I'm not just saying just misery in terms of violence. We're talking about torture. We're talking about a willful extermination of the population, right? When you know, this is a pretty, I know what I'm going to say is a bit audacious here, but I mean, who's really going to back the Assad regime in Syria in a contemporary sense, right? You know, at the time of this video being uploaded, you have arguably a regime that is either directly or indirectly, it doesn't matter if it's direct or indirect, but is systematically exterminating its opposition in broad daylight, for all practical purposes, right? Is killing its opposition in broad daylight, and its opposition is overwhelmingly described and defined in terms of their gender and their age. He's killing, the regime is indirectly, at least, or directly, at worst, killing, you know, women and children, including men, of course. But I mean, you know, it's unthinkable. It's absolutely unthinkable to have a regime that's in place to exacerbate the misery of its population. I mean, by any socio-political, any social contract theory, the second the regime systematically resorts to the willful extermination of vast segments of the population, we're not talking about calculated assassinations, we're not talking about, you know, precise killings, sanctioned violence, you can believe it or not, agree with it, blah, 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 it doesn't really matter. You know, at least my view is, okay, there might be instances in which, and I'm not going to go into this because it doesn't really apply to Al-Farabi at all, there might be instances in which the state is justified in systematic killings, right? The death penalty, for example. It doesn't have to be as insane as assassinations. But the idea that the regime, that the state is going to be directed specifically towards increasing the misery of the population, the question is, here's a why that I will answer. Why would the regime want to do that? Because what you want to do is you want to strike fear in your opposition, right? You want to maintain power by creating a fear-filled environment, and the way that you best maximize fear is by literally increasing the misery of the population, right? So you go out and you start killing people, and people become fearful and they bow, right? And this is not in the Machiavellian sense, because those of you who've read The Prince recognize it's expressly forbidden in the text to undermine your power by overreaching this idea of fear by actually abusing the population to this level. Why? Because, you know, misery is never the goal, right? So if it is the case that the regime is just in place and all you ever hear that the regime is doing is killing its own people and exacerbating the misery of the people, I mean, it gets to the point where it gets to the point where the regime becomes evil, right? And I recognize that people, social scientists particularly, hate the word evil. I've done all the research, I know this. And you don't have to evoke the spirits in order for us to make sense of evil. Evil in a very pragmatic sense, right? You ought not to be killing systematically groups of your citizenry simply because they don't agree with your position, and label that evil, right? So we don't have to go off into the discourse on does evil really exist or not, right? If you are arguing whether or not evil exists, you know, it's great from a theoretical standpoint. It'll be cool to watch you at a conference. In the real world, you know, John and Jane Doe don't want to hear about theoretical denials of the existence of evil, because you tell the families of those children that were brutally shot and murdered that evil doesn't exist in the world. You know, it's ridiculous. It's an absurd assumption to even suggest that evil isn't something that's real, right? You can talk about it in terms of violence, sure, but, you know, I'm going to talk about it in terms of evil. So, and it's not just me, Al-Farabi that talks about it in terms of evil. So the obligation then for Al-Farabi for human happiness is one of service, right? You have to recognize that it's not self-service, right? If it's all about me, if it's all about me serving my own needs, right? This would never work. I would never have the viewership that I do. Me personally, I could never get satisfaction if all that, I couldn't even be that type of person. If everything that I tried to do was facilitated as means to exacerbate and increase the misery of others, I mean, what type of person is that? Like, who is that person? And in all fairness, and this is going to be, and I'm not going to touch this too much, because some things are better left unsaid. I'll let you draw the inference for yourself. No individual human being, I think, is wholly capable of sadism as such. You have sadistic people, but even sadistic people have a pet that they love or have a family member that they love. There's something that they're connected to. And if it's not, I mean, I can think of a few instances, right? And it wouldn't be Adolf Hitler, right? It would be someone like Cho in the Virginia Tech murders. A dude like that could potentially be wholly sadistic, right? He just seemed like he was off from the beginning. He's never been connected to anyone. He only thinks about killing and destroying others, and then he ends his own life in a flurry of violence. It's just so ego-driven, and it's so antisocial in a real sense, pathological in the physically manifest sense. It's not to say that there's gradations of sadism, and I don't know if there are gradations of sadism. I'd have to ask my psychologist friends that watch me, which would be in itself an interesting side analysis, right? I don't know anything about that, but there should be sort of gradations, because I can make distinctions between types of sadism, more intense and less intense, all directed towards the same ends, though, right? Which would be interesting study. If you know of this, please send me links, because those type of books I'd like to read. I would love to read. But since service is voluntary, and since humans can choose not to serve, as I showed an hour ago, thereby only serving themselves, the sort of egocentric sadist, the regime, as also defined by the relationship of class, serve, can slip into a state of misery, right? Since there is a recognition of service, and then obviously the ruler serves the people, right? The ruler serves the aggregate, so that there's sort of this hermeneutic, everyone's being served in some sense. There is a sense in which we can come to the recognition, and I think it's stuff like this that really unnerves me, right? Because I see the trend in the literature. This is why I wrote my dissertation, because I saw the trend. It's like I read Gazette many times over, maybe 2 or 3 times over. You know, you read Freire, and you're like, everybody's touching on the same thing. This idea of the mass man in Gazette, like now I'm thinking about it, I'm like, you know what, I might actually pick